Here is a man in New York around 1950. He's not a visual artist. He is a musician, a composer. He's been trained by some rather eminent modernist composers. He knows how to make that weird music they used to make called modern music, which was really hard to hear and had lots of wrong notes in it. Most people felt that way about modern music in the 1950s. Understandably, it takes a good deal of serious, prolonged study and attention to, say, a piece by Arnold Schoenberg, one of the leading dissonant composers, to get it and start enjoying it and appreciating it. And most people don't want to spend that kind of work time just to understand a piece of music, including many composers who resisted the onslaught of modern music at the time. Cage is not really like that. He's very interested in anything that's unusual and different sounding. And what he does, rather than continue to make even more dissonant, complex, confusing music for people to have to study hard to understand, is he abandons that completely and does the opposite. In other words, he is a genuine modernist. And what is the opposite? Well, it would be something like row, row, row your boat, right? Something very easy to hear, something very simple without a lot of complicated, strange dynamic markings and strange chord progressions and things that people have trouble with in the music world. But it would have to be different than just children's song. It would have to be strange in some new way. So what he started doing was experimenting with the instruments themselves, toying with the piano, playing a piece on the piano, not with the keys, but by fooling around with the strings inside the giant piano case, starting to make pieces of music that are composed for a tea kettle on the hot plate as it reaches boiling point and starts creating a whistling noise. Anything that provides sound that is not associated with the great tradition of Western music history was fair game in the mind of this composer. One of the most famous, if not the most famous work he composed was 4 minutes and 33 seconds. John Cage. It was published by one of the most prestigious music publishing houses in the world, Edition Peters, which is associated with the great legacy of Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart, etc. And this piece was composed by Cage specifically to be played at first by the piano, a solo piano performance. So it was scored, as we say, for piano, solo piano. John Cage was a pianist, and he came out on stage in his white tie and tails and bowed in front of an audience that had assembled to listen to this piece. And as he sat down, he got a pocket watch out of his coat. And he snapped the button, started the watch going, and didn't do anything. He had lifted the case, the cover over the keyboard, so it looked as if he was about to play the piano, but he didn't actually put his fingers on the keyboard at all. After about a minute, minute and a half, he clicked his stopwatch, put it back in his pocket, sat there at the piano. People were really confused. They thought that he had forgotten how to play the music, whatever. People started to hem and haw, as we say. They were muttering among themselves in the audience, people starting to cough rather aggressively, trying to get him to wake up and do his job. Then he started up again. He did this 3 times with his pocket watch, never actually playing the piano. Finally, he put the cover back over the keyboard, stood up, bowed, and walked off stage, by which time, after 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the audience was hooting and howling and, throwing tomatoes, so to speak. I don't know that anybody did that, but they used to. Okay. The music had been performed, just not by John Cage, right? John Cage didn't make any sounds, but he allowed the audience, without their realizing it perhaps, to make new sounds in the context of the classical music world. Well, this idea, making nothing as your art, was a very exciting idea. This young man, Robert Rauschenberg, a painter, well-trained, coming out of Texas to New York to make his name, because New York was the new art world center that had taken over the role of being the top center for the Western art world from Paris, France, of all places, following the end of World War II. And here it is around 1949, 1950. Rauschenberg comes to town. What does he make? You can see him sitting in front of it in a gallery. It's 7 panels painted white. They're of the same dimension and they're clipped together from behind so that you could make a painting of 5 panels or 3 panels or 1 panel just as easily as all 7. There's nothing special about the way they're painted. They were probably painted with white paint from a house paint can using a roller. So there's no brush work or anything like that. Here's the 3 white panels version of his painting. Yeah. Nothing as art, you might say. Why? Well, it became a little clearer here. About 10 years later, by which time he had become a pretty well-known presence in the modern art world in New York, he was asked to contribute a portrait of his gallerist, the woman who represented his art in the city of Paris, France. Her name was Iris Clert, Iris Claire in French. And he lived in New York, and he didn't have time, he said, to fly out to Paris and paint her portrait and have it included in the exhibition. So instead, he went down to the Western Union Telegram Station in his part of Manhattan. Those used to be common. In order to make a quick reply to someone cheaply who lived across the world, you used the telegraph still. And that's what he did. He went and paid for a telegram to be sent to Iris Claire's gallery on the Rue du Saint-Honoré in Paris. And it said, "This is a portrait of Iris Claire, if I say so. Robert Rauschenberg." There you go. There is no portrait of Iris Claire by Robert Rauschenberg, but there is, because an artist, credentialed, qualified, recognized, his works reviewed in the New York Times, had shows, solo shows even, says so. Well, who is better qualified to tell you when there's a portrait by someone than the person who made the portrait? And this is the portrait of Iris Claire. Now, you may think that's totally stupid and bogus. You may say it sucks. But you can't say it isn't true, because this is the definition of art. Throughout history, the artist does tell you when they've made a work of art. Now, you can say this is such a bad work of art, we won't pay it further attention. It's totally awful. But you can't say it isn't a work of art. You see what I'm saying? Quality is irrelevant in the definition of art at this point. It is now officially completely irrelevant. It is instead the artist who expands or theoretically contracts the definition of art itself. Joe Kossuth, a bit younger, comes to New York by way of Yale University, where he was not an art major, but he did take some philosophy classes. And he has immediate success with a solo show at the age of 20, not quite 20, I think, in 1965 in New York City, exhibiting, well, we'll see. Why you make the work is far more important than how you make the work. Summing up what I've been telling you in a beautifully concise and eloquent statement, why you make the work is far more important than how you make the work. This is thought of now often as the definition of conceptual art. Conceptual art is art which is about its concept. A work of art that is conceptual art is a work of art which is essentially made up of its idea, the concept behind it. The concept matters far more than how the concept is presented. The idea the artist has for a work of art matters more than the work of art itself. And in fact, the idea for the work of art in conceptual art world is the work of art. Well, then what does that make the work of art that represents the idea? Well, it relegates the work of art, as we would normally think of it, the thing that represents the concept, it relegates to a lower status. It is an artifact. It is an object or an exhibit, a demonstration, an example. It is the presentation of the concept. 1 and 3 Chairs, 1965, part of a solo show of works by Joseph Kossuth, who's still working, by the way. He's a very eminent, much lauded painter, or artist, sorry, who he doesn't work with paint, who recently had the unprecedented honor in the world of art of being granted his own solo show of new work by none other than the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. The Louvre, the most famous museum in the world, probably because it houses, among other things, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, has never allowed modern work, let alone work by living contemporary artists, into its doors. It's a collection of old art that ends at around 1850. But they made an exception for Joe Kossuth, and he was the first ever invitee by the curator of the Louvre to have a solo show. Well, here's a pretty good example of what he did. 1 and 3 Chairs. So you got a chair, an actual store-bought chair. It looks like it's pretty well worn, but it's one of those cheap wooden chairs. Nowadays, you get them in plastic and steel that are found on the furniture aisle at Walmart for $16.95 or whatever. That's what this was back in the 60s. Extraordinarily common, very inexpensive. And next to it, a blow-up to just about what looks like exactly the same scale of the same, very same chair, set out in exactly the spot you see it in, but in a black and white photo that's been blown up and put on the wall. And then to the right, the dictionary definition of the word chair from the latest edition of the Webster's Collegiate. And that's the work. It wasn't the only work in the show. There was also 1 and 3 pans, 1 and 3 saws, shovels, lamps. Well, there's a detail. Does that help you appreciate it? How about even the crates that the lamp and the saw and other things came in, becoming part of the exhibition? I think you get the idea. Let's see if he can explain himself. A work of art, Joe Kossuth is saying, is a kind of proposition presented within the context of art as a comment on art. So he's proposing a presentation to you. You're the public, you're the spectator, you go to the art gallery. This artist is proposing something to you. It is something about art, commenting on art. That is, if viewed within their context as art, works of art provide no information whatsoever about any matter of fact. A work of art is a tautology. A tautology is a word you should look up in the dictionary. It's an interesting definition. It's a thing that's defined only by itself. You can only understand it through the experience of it. It cannot be explained adequately through analogy to something like it or opposite of it. It is itself and only itself. And he's saying that a work of art is definable only by itself, in that it is a presentation of the artist's intention. That is, they are saying that that particular work of art is art, which means that particular work of art is a definition of art. A definition, not the definition, but a definition of art. The value, he says, of particular artists after Duchamp, that's Marcel Duchamp, the man who made the fountain we looked at last time, the man who made LHOOQ with the Mona Lisa reproduction, remember? How could you forget? The value of particular artists after Duchamp can be weighed according to how much they questioned the nature of art. Here's another work, 1967, Joe Kossuth, titled, it's called, Just kind of a joke, you see. That's about as funny as he ever got. He's a pretty serious guy, Joe Kossuth. Title, because of course there were so many works of art being made by 1967 called Untitled, one of the most infuriating titles any artist has ever been able to use, right? Which is probably why it's so popular, because why even tell us it's untitled, right? If you don't have a title, at least don't tell us anything about the title. Don't say untitled, but it's always bothered me. Sorry, I'm getting off track. Titled, art as idea, as idea. And what is it? It's the dictionary definition of the word art. How about this? Blue, red, yellow, purple, green, orange. Well, you know those colors, right? They are, respectively, the three primaries and the three secondaries. Here, represented, each of them by a dictionary definition blown up and reproduced on the canvas. Glass words material described. Gray concrete floor surface. How about 1 through 25? Generally, in the last 30 years, Kossuth's main medium, not oil on canvas, not marble, has been neon lights, neon signs. He doesn't make them himself. He just has a neon sign maker make them. He tells them what the text should be. It gets made, it gets put on display. How can that be, right? You're thinking an artist is supposed to be at least interested in their medium, and he's thought a little bit about it. He says, what do I really want people to get? I want them to read the words and then think about them in the context of an art space, the world of art. This is a comment on the definition of art, not meant to represent anything other than a comment within the ongoing conversation. It's a part of an ongoing discourse of modern art. And this makes sense if you think about it. Modernism is about what's new. It's not about the quality of the workmanship of the thing. Quality of workmanship may be required if the idea that prompts the making of the work benefits from high quality workmanship. And many contemporary artists make work which is pretty impressively made, well made. These are probably very well made neon signs, but that's all he needed to make his point, to add his comment to the conversation. 5 words in orange neon. 4 colors, 4 words. I think you're beginning to get the idea, right? Okay, there he is thinking. Huh? He's got an idea. Now, it's true, Joe Kossuth has had a relatively small number of new ideas, but it's hard to come up with a really intriguing new idea in the modernist art world. It's very different kind of hard from the difficulty it required to become a master draftsman of the human figure, like Michelangelo, for example. That's extremely hard too, but it's hard to come up with new ideas. So he's still thinking. Okay, I'm going to go on, not performance, I'm going to go on and talk about John Baldessari. Baldessari, who just died at the beginning of this year, I believe, in his late 80s, was a contemporary of Joe Kossuth. And in his early career, he was also based in New York. He made works like this. Tips for artists who want to sell. Artists who want to sell. In other words, advice from an older artist who knows how to make a living as an artist to a younger artist. In fact, these were comments that Baldessari received from his own graphic design instructor when he was in college. His graphic design instructor, as so many in the country were back in the 1960s, was actually a sign painter by training. And that meant actually lettering with paint and brush on a sign to make nice, organized letters. And that was graphic design to a great many people back in the 60s. And that's part of the point that Baldessari is making here. This is not well designed. It's clear and legible, but it makes numerous errors in elementary graphic design that most students, I hope, are being steered away from early in their training. That's part of the point. The rest of it is that these are the pieces of advice he received, and by now you've read them, they're rather ridiculous. Here's another work by Baldassari. I had this old pencil on the dashboard of my car for a long time. Every time I saw it, I felt uncomfortable since its point was so dull and dirty. I always intended to sharpen it, and finally couldn't bear it any longer and did sharpen it. I'm not sure, but I think that this has something to do with art. So one thing you can see right away is different between Baldassari and Joseph Kosuth. John Baldassari has a sense of humor. In fact, most of his work is marked by a rather impish, naughty sense of humor. He is slyly suggesting something to you and insinuating his idea through the charm of humor. This is, I will not make any more boring art. It's actually not. I will not make any more boring art was an event that occurred over a phone conversation in 1971. Baldassari was asked to come up to Buffalo, New York to visit the State University campus there and give a lecture as a visiting artist to a group of students in an art class there. And he couldn't make it. Bad weather, upstate New York, driving through the night, wasn't going to do it. So he made a phone call instead, and he told the students there in the classroom, do you have chalkboards in your classroom? They said, yeah. He said, okay, here's what I want you to do. This is the main point I was going to make tonight anyway. Go around all the chalkboards as a group, get out your chalk, and write 50 times on each chalkboard the words, I will not make any more boring art, which they did. That was the work of art, the phone call, which of course was ephemeral. It no longer existed after they hung up. So, in order to let the rest of the art world know, John Baldassari filmed himself writing 50 times, actually more than that, on several pieces of paper, the same sentence, I will not make any more boring art. The film became the artifact for the gallery exhibition of the original work of art, kind of like seeing a reproduction of a work of art. And then the individual sheets of paper became mementos that could be sold as trinkets by people who wanted something to remember the event that they never witnessed by. Here's a still from another film by John Baldassari, Teaching a Plant the Alphabet. I think you get the whole thing already. Over a period of about 10 minutes, you watch as Baldassari, off camera except for his hand, puts a succession of signs in front of a houseplant, each of which contains a blow-up of the capital and lowercase version of each of the 26 letters in the alphabet. And as he puts each one up, you hear his voice off camera repeating A, 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 B, B, B. Here's another work by John Baldassari, more typical of his work in the last 30 years, I would say. Consists of a candid, still shot of a movie star. I think this is Ava Gardner from the 1950s, which has been tinted rather strangely, except for the eyes, which he simply got from public domain and blew up. And then on the other side of the surface is a list of words. And the words represent descriptors, modifiers that might plausibly be applied to the expression on Ava Gardner's face. Interesting, huh? Here's another one. Sylvia Christel, another actress, French actress, seen in profile here. And a bunch of words describing her. And by the way, her face is completely without expression. She is simply showing her profile. She has no expression on her face to speak of. But all of these describing words, these modifiers, seem to suggest there's something negative about it. She is described as icy, impassive, stony, suspicious, treacherous, unpleasant, haughty. Interesting. It's how we're reading a facial expression. One of the chief subjects of study among art historians, particularly those who study art from the Western tradition, which features so much portraiture and figurative art. What is the expression on the face of the figure studied? Well, that seems to be the theme in John Baldessari's art. But he's suggesting to us something about the nature of our interpretation of a person's facial expression through the use of language to describe it. I think it's pretty fair to say that none of these words does justice to the enigmatic blank expression on Sylvia Christel's face. And that's, I think, the point of the work. There's another work by Baldessari. Consists of reproductions blown up from the actual Sherwin-Williams paint catalog from 2006 or so, in which certain colors are presented. They are pre-blended at the factory and sold in cans, or can be blended on site if you go to Walmart. And there you go with the actual titles or names of each of those colors, which were devised by some committee at the paint company. All right. They have a history, these kinds of things. We talked briefly about René Magritte and the Surrealist movement and how he became fascinated by the treachery of words, of languages, of images. And here you see an example. Who is to say what represents what here? It is an arbitrary application of certain shapes which form certain letters, which are to pronounce certain sounds, which are to represent certain ideas, which are emblematically exemplified by certain objects. But all of that is an arbitrary, easily exchangeable tradition accepted among members of the society, share a certain language. And that's the theme of a great deal of conceptual art. Now, why? Because we're questioning the definition of things here. Is that a clock or is it a wind? What if we chose suddenly to decide we would call it a wind from now on? Well, then everybody would eventually get used to calling a clock a wind, and it would be a wind, wouldn't it? In effect, it would be a wind, especially once everybody had forgotten that we used to call it a clock. This is at the heart of a good deal of conceptual art, language itself, because language is the descriptor of things as well as ideas. I'm going to leave you with this last example of conceptual art, and let this be, I hope, an inspiration to you junior fledgling conceptual artists at the end of our semester. This is a photograph of Tullio de Santis. Tullio de Santis is an American who's a New Yorker. He's been in the art world since at least the early to mid 1980s. He's been a gallery dealer, a gallerist, as well as an artist. And he has a certain status within the art world. He's not a world famous contemporary artist, but he gets invited to art shows to contribute to latest trend in the art world from time to time in Manhattan. And at one point, he was given the invitation to contribute a work to a new show that was being put up by the gallerist at a small gallery in Chelsea in New York City that would focus on the theme of small works. So that was the only stipulation, was that you contribute something small. 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper is pretty small, and that's what he contributed. And he went to the gallery, or maybe he just asked them to take the sheet of paper after they'd printed it on their own printer and put it on the wall with a couple of thumbtacks, which is what they did. And it was his contribution to that work, which otherwise was populated by objects on the wall, works of art, paintings, collages, whatever. And this is what it says. Undefined concept piece for NAP. My persona-based work has been moving toward concept only for some time. I've come to the conclusion that I will do a purely conceptual work for the upcoming exhibition of small works. I'll use a name for myself, and the rest will be unbounded, empty. I've come to see identity as one of the few subjects left after one strips away much of the object-oriented aspects of artwork. Beneath all aspects of craft, there are conceptual underpinnings that cause me to seriously consider the notion that after concept, the rest is craft, and in many ways has no essential significance. Now here's the crux of it. Further, I'm coming to see the definition of concept as unnecessary and counterproductive. Hence, the intention to exhibit nothing. For a lot of reasons, it's fairly difficult to pull this off. Instead of spending any more time thinking, I rang up my friend, James Carroll, who I'd run into at the museum. We hadn't seen each other in many years, and he asked me to give him a call. I pitched the idea of participating in the show with undefined conceptual work. He liked the idea, so it's a go. That's all there is to say about it, and there is certainly no reason to attend the exhibition in order to experience my work. All that's needed is to know about it. And DeSantis signed his name and dated it. So that's the work of art. The work of art in this case featured no craft, because after concept, the rest is craft and is of no essential significance. This is in effect a very old idea by this time. 2006 versus 1965, that's, what is that? I don't know, 40 years since Joe Kossuth stated, why you make the work of art is far more important than how you make the work of art. Same idea. What's unique and new, and you got to have something unique and new, is that he says the definition of concept is unnecessary and counterproductive. By the way, he didn't explain why, but he does state this as a fact. He's coming to see the definition of concept as unnecessary and counterproductive. So he exhibits nothing. In other words, he had some kind of idea maybe, but he never really thought it through or came up with a definable idea. He couldn't express the idea. Maybe he didn't really have an idea in the first place, and that's the work of art. Now, as far as I could tell, in 2006, that was about the most purely conceptual work of art I had heard of to date. I was so curious, I called up the gallerist at the NAP and asked them, by the way, did anyone buy Tullio DeSantis's work? And the gallerist assistant who answered the phone said, yeah, it was sold. And I said, well, can you tell me how much it was sold for? And I was told, no, we don't give out that information. I said, all right, I'm just a college professor. I don't have any commercial interest. Let me ask you, if I give you a ballpark number, will you say yes or no? And I got to between $5,000 and $10,000. And he said, yeah, it's in there.